Region Park, and this is the southern boundary.
Joe Elkerton knows his way around the streets of Toronto. In many ways, he's never really left them.
But I was born King and Parliament area, the youngest of 11. Kind of grew up, really fast there. My parents had been products of the residential school system, and they had kind of all those challenges that people of their generation had, and a lot with alcohol and drugs, who at times would leave us for weeks and then months, and got to the point where they had started to use my brothers and sisters to help support their habits by engaging in sex work with them.
Their addictions tore the family apart in more ways than one. It was a Salvation Army worker that first alerted the authorities of what was going on. As a 3-year-old, Joe's life changed.
My birth mother ended up going to jail for 6 years, and my birth father for 8 years, and we were taken to an orphanage.
Joe and his sister were adopted by a white couple in the city at a time when interracial adoptions were rare and ridiculed. Elkerton says though he was grateful for a good home, it led to a lifelong struggle with his Aboriginal identity.
My parents encouraged me to explore what that meant. And I remember as a teenager, I called up the Friendship Center, and I kind of said, listen, I'd like to come down there and talk to people. And the guy on the phone said, this is for Indian people. I remember going down there and they're saying, yeah, you look like us, but you don't sound like us. And it's just like, there was attitudes towards me because I'd grown up in white culture. They called me like lost brother or apple, red on the outside, white on the inside.
The one place Elkerton found acceptance was on the streets. And after falling into his own addictions, he ended up living there.
I think for me, I found probably more comforting just kind of being with guys who were involved in kind of street culture, because it wasn't such a big deal then. It was just like, oh, there's Joe, he's a native guy, but he's one of us.
Once again, a Salvation Army worker would change the course of Joe Elkerton's life. Not that he was looking for any help.
We ended up having this conversation. I remember I said to her, I said, like, what entitles you to talk to me? Like, you have no idea what my life is about. You have no idea. And she says, well, I can see you're kind of like living this street life. And she says, I grew up in Vancouver, and I was involved in the drug culture in Vancouver, and kind of know what you're going through and where you've been. And we ended up having this long conversation, and she ended up taking me to the Salvation Army Drop-In Center. And it was December of 1980. I remember her kind of at one point just saying, listen, I think I've answered all your questions. Why don't you just give your heart to Jesus? And I said, okay.
Elkerton hit a few bumps on the road to faith, including some bad experiences in church. But he says there was always something driving him, a conviction that he finally found his true identity.
There was this change happening in my heart, in my spirit, just kind of around acceptance. And I think that sensing that, whether the church understood me or accepted me was irrelevant. The fact was that Jesus had accepted me, which I think I had sought for kind of in the culture that I grew up in with my parents, but also kind of seeking that acceptance with a native culture and struggling with it, and people struggling kind of to allow me into that thing. And I think with Jesus, there was this kind of like, hey, none of this matters. You're just with me.
Elkerton ended up right back on the streets where he came from. This time, he was the Salvation Army worker. It was a road that would lead him back to his roots and calling.
They were starting this native church at the Scott Mission, and I went down to give my testimony. I've been kind of struggling with the idea of being in ministry. I didn't mind like helping out, but like being like the guy in ministry was something I was kind of struggling with. But I also felt in my heart that God was calling me into native ministry. So I went down to this church that was starting at Scott Mission. I went and gave my testimony. You got to remember, I hadn't seen family since I was very, very young. Sitting in the congregation at Scott Mission was an aunt who recognized the story and got on the phone the next week, called my sister in Vancouver and said, I found your brother.
That phone call started a family reunion of sorts. Though they were scattered across the country, many of his siblings also had found faith in Jesus. Elkerton says meeting them was a healing experience.
And it was that following week, I remember in my prayer time, I was sitting there and I felt God speaking to my heart again, saying, you need to be in Native ministry. And I started saying, but I don't have a Native family. He says, I just reconnected you with like your brothers and sisters. It's like, okay, well, I don't have a Native identity. And he says, your experience of disenfranchisement, like your separation, your struggle for identity, living in these different cultures, struggling with addiction, all these things, the loss and the pain that you have, that is your identity. And you are a Native person, so you do have a Native identity or a Native experience.
So he went to seminary and pastored a Native church in downtown Toronto. Most of his congregation were street involved. Struggling through these challenges, he turned to his Bible and found a passage that inspired him to take action. It was the story of Nehemiah, a Hebrew leader who rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem.
The book starts with the question of, what's happened to the land of my forefathers? And Nehemiah prays and he develops this plan to rebuild the walls and to build strong gates. And part of that, and as I began to meditate and think about that, it was really about creating safe community. It's about if your city has strong walls and strong gates, then the people who live inside that city are safe to make healthy choices around education, spirituality, love, family, all those type of things. And we'll just cruise around and see who's out and who's out on the street tonight.
And that's how Project 417, named after that particular verse in Nehemiah, got rolling. It's an inner city ministry that seeks to rebuild the broken through outreach and relationship. Tonight, Elkerton and some young volunteers are offering refreshments to those working in the sex trade. It's his own connection to the streets and the broken who live here that has cemented Elkerton's mind that this is where he was born to be.
So you have to have really good eyes for this job, eh, Joe?
Absolutely. I think it's, and kind of being able, I think, just to read the street and read your environment.
Many on the streets are victims of human trafficking. That's why Project 417 is part of a network of ministries working with police and political agencies to raise awareness and reach out to those in need. It's a big job, sometimes too big. But there's something that keeps him on these streets of Toronto. He says it's his place of worship.
Jesus said, as you did it to the least of them, you did it to me. And I think that, you know, beyond just an act of justice, it really becomes an act of worship. If Jesus says you're doing it to me, then it is worship. We have a spiritual mandate here. Part of it is to worship Christ through our actions and to be involved in people's redemption and to, you know, be that voice of hope to them.
Elkerton says that hope extends to all, including his birth mother, whom he met shortly before she died.
I remember one of our conversations was that she didn't know how things would play out, but just trying to assure her that, you know, that God's grace was sufficient for her life and that all the sinister things that each one of us do through our lives, if we come and give them to God, that they're taken care of. That was, I think, the interesting thing and the important thing, I think, for my birth mom to hear.
That forgiveness was crucial for him to move on with his life and leave the pain of his past behind. Though Elkerton is still confronted with pain everywhere he goes, especially on these familiar streets. Once his home, now his heart. In Toronto, Denise, Lodde, 100 Huntley Street.